Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 20th of March of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Belgorod area, about the clashes on the Borderlands, and according to information we have this morning, the Russians announced that from March 20th, entry into the territory of Tonenke, Glotovo, Gory, Podol, and many other different towns and villages will be limited, and the roadblocks will be set up. Governor of the Belgorod region, Gladkov. So basically, when we turn back to map, we can make a conclusion. The Russians made a decision to restrict the access of people to this area, and mainly due to, let's say, first of all, let's say due to security reason, not to risk with people's lives, because there are lots of towns, buildings, houses, people have a lot of their own stuff. So maybe first day they evacuated, but now they need to get, let's say, their passport, their IDs, their documents, so they try to return back, and of course this may cause some problems for the military on the ground and so on. This is the first reason. The second reason is that the Ukrainians, regarding the reports from the Ministry of Defense, continue advancing, continue spreading their foothold, and continue gaining bigger and bigger foothold every single day. Because, for example, today, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the Russian units fully mopped up Tonenke of the rest of Ukraine militants and continued to carry out activities to prevent sabotage and reconnaissance groups of the armed forces of Ukraine from entering the border area. As a result of clashes, air strikes, artillery fire, the Ukrainians lost up to 650 soldiers, 2 armored fighting vehicles, and 2 Czech-made vampires. So, according to the Russians, the Ukrainians were completely defeated, and many other things. But according to geolocations, we see a completely different picture. Now let's return back to geolocations, let's discuss. So before we continue, first of all, the situation in Tonenke and this area reminds me, first of all, the situation in Kharkiv. And I'm afraid that this Tonenke will completely repeat the story of Kharkiv. What does it mean? It means that the Russians almost every single day since the beginning, since the creation of Kharkiv foothold, when the Ukrainians landed in the area, always every single day we got report. The Russians managed to clear completely. The Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to fall back. The Russians, the Ukrainians had significant losses. Billions of soldiers of Ukrainians sank in the river, and many other different reports. But every single day we got a completely different picture when the Ukrainians managed to develop their foothold. Of course, in the end, they were defeated completely and having significant loss, were forced to fall back. But now I see that there are very high chances that the situation in this area will develop the same way. On this video, we just saw the Russian, let's say, bombings of the territory. Furthermore, we got additional reports of how the Russians were, let's say, conducting reconnaissance operation, trying to, let's say, discover the Ukrainian positions. And after they discover another Ukrainian, let's say, positions, the Russians sent a tank and attacked the tank with a very close distance of the Ukrainian armed forces. For example, the Russians do have a possibility and do have access to enter this area with tanks, with armored vehicles, without any risk of being hit or destroyed by the Ukrainians. Maybe the Russians managed to establish, let's say, very powerful electronic warfare equipment in the area, and they are able to suppress Ukrainian drones or heavy drones or something like this. We see the tank attacking the Ukrainian positions, but from the other side we got another video. Let's take a look at this video. The Ukrainian stronghold in the area, the Russians brought reinforcement and tried to storm the building. If you remember, this is the building that Ukrainians were using to attack Russian tank with grenade launcher. We discussed this video yesterday. The Russians tried to storm the area with significant number of infantry. According to, as I understand, there are not so many soldiers were inside of the building, but at some point something went wrong. There was an explosion, maybe grenade returned back. There was a very heavy explosion there in the area, and after that the Russians were forced to finish the attempts to storm the area. The Ukrainian soldiers from the second floor start counter-attacking the Russians, and at some point the Russians decided to leave the area without continuing the clashes. So it's very difficult to understand what exactly is going on there. From the other side, we continue receiving the videos of how the Ukrainians send additional reinforcements, additional supplies, support to the border. So for now, I believe that we need to keep everything as is until we receive more or less reliable geolocations, videos or footage, or either of the Russian control or of Ukraine control. And as I understand, based on this area, the best evidence is, let's say, Russian flag or Ukrainian flag, either on this or that part of the borderlands. For now, the situation is very complicated and completely covered with the fog of war. And another important thing about the area, today we got another video confirming the presence and the use of Romanian, let's say, volunteers or Romanian mercenaries as a part of Ukrainian proxy forces who were involved in the Borderlands operation. So now we see that there were really lots of forces, and currently the Ukrainians used a lot of forces in this operation, very likely, and we see that the operation was well prepared. Regarding the losses and regarding the current situation, the Ukrainians have no limits and have no problems with artillery rounds, with artillery shells. They can conduct a successful, more or less, counter-artillery duels. The only important, let's say, numbers, we can discuss it every single day. The Russians reports about another destroyed Chasiv multiple launch rocket system Vampire. Just for today, probably the Russians reported that they managed to destroy 2 of them. So every single day we see that Ukrainians do have a lot of weapon, that most of the weapon they haven't used, let's say, in Avdiivka directions, in Robotyne, just because of the fact that they want to save as many as possible weapon and to keep the operation in secret and not to waste a weapon before the beginning of this operation, as the Ukrainians, for example, wasted their army and their weapon before, let's say, Robotyne and Zaporozhye greatest counter-offensive operation, because before that attack, the Ukrainians lost significant number of forces in Bakhmut, and after that they started offensive and they lost the rest of the forces. Now they decided and made the decision to follow, let's say, the Western, let's say, I don't know, Western instructors' orders, and now they do everything as the NATO officers told them to do. Now we are moving further to northern Kupiansk direction. We haven't received anything from the area, just a small activity on the borderlands between, let's say, Kupiansk area and the village by the name of Orazova. So we see a certain activity on this direction from either from the Russian and the Ukrainian side. So maybe, and very likely, the next few days, next maybe weeks, something big is going to happen here. And I'll remind you that this is exactly the territory that Ukrainians are planning to start force evacuation. The Ukrainians have already started this forced evacuation, and they're planning to replace civilians in the area with military forces, with the purpose, of course, to slow down and to stop the Russians. Now we are moving to the southern Kupiansk direction. We have additional reports and updates from the territory. This morning we have already discussed some reports from the ground that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control and to get as close as possible to the village by the name of Terny. And according to the Russian, let's say, sources, this is approximately the current control over the territory by the armed forces of Russian Federation. And later we got the geolocated video confirming the Russian attack. But when talking about the attack, I can't tell for sure whether that attack was successful or it just was another, I don't know, very powerful attack, but with significant losses from the Russian side. Of course, the video was published by the 60th Mechanized Brigade, and of course I don't think we should have expected to receive something else, just the losses from the Russian side. But anyway, on this video we can see how the Russian personnel carrier arrived in the area, and after that the Ukrainians start bombing and attacking this territory with all types of weapons they have. But anyway, this video at least confirms that the Russians reached at least the outskirts of this tree line. Very likely that the Russians managed to dig in deeper, and of course the Russians continue movements along these forests. So if we calculate the distance from, let's say, even from the edge position of this tree line towards, let's say, these brushes and the first buildings in Terny, the distance is less than 750 meters. So the Russians are about and on the distance of the rifle fire, of course, the sniper fire, of course, and even on the distance of tank and mortar strikes. So of course now the Russians have lots of opportunities, lots of let's say ways how to continue their offensive. They can attack the Ukrainians through the fields towards the farms, and very likely that the Russians are going to attack this area first of all, because this is more or less, let's say, comfortable position, or let's say comfortable foothold for further offensive. But to do this attack, of course, first of all, it's better for the Russians to establish control over these three lines, to have more or less reliable supply road that they can use to send forces, let's say, from this area towards the farms in the north eastern part of Terny. Of course, the Russians can continue offensive operation further through the forest and to attack the Ukrainians in this area. Anyway, the operation is about to start. I will not be surprised if we receive the first videos of clashes inside of Terny, maybe the next few even days. The situation is very sick to the final stage. Furthermore, the most important important thing is that according to Russian sources, the forces of 21st Separate Mechanized Brigade have already lost their combat capabilities and were replaced from the line of combat contact towards the direction of the mainland with the purpose to replace the losses. Now we are moving to Bilohorivka. The clashes continue and surround the landfill. The Russians still haven't managed to establish control over the landfill, and this is a very big problem for them. This is probably 6th or 5th attempt in a row from the Russian side to attack the area, but all of those attacks were repelled by the Ukrainians in the past, and another Russian attack was repulsed recently by the Ukrainian armed forces. On this video, for example, we can see the Ukrainian soldiers who started clearing operation in the trenches in front of the landfill, and they were clearing the, let's say, the trenches, the strongholds that were captured by the Russians probably a day or two ago, but later, as a result of Ukrainian counterattacks, the Russians were forced to fall back, and now the Ukrainians were clearing the area. So once again, according to that video, we can make a conclusion that just maybe 3 days ago or 2 days ago, the Russians controlled something like this and got as close as possible to the landfill, but later, maybe as a result of FPV drone strikes, maybe the result of counterattack, the Russians were forced to fall back from the area, and then the Ukrainians started clearing operation. So this is the current situation on this side of the landfill. The Ukrainians still hold this defense belt, and the Russians still need additional time to bypass the area. From the other side, we see how the Russians attack and bomb and FPV droning the Ukrainian defense belt to the south, so the landfill, another area. So maybe from this direction the Russians will be more successful than the eastern part, but anyway, regarding the, let's say, the destination and direction of Russian attack, anyway, it's going to be a very difficult operation. This is not Terny, this is a much more bigger landfill, and there are much more, let's say, fire positions, including the fire positions behind the landfill. So this is probably the worst, let's say, foothold that we can see on this let's say all along the entire Ukraine when talking about the line of combat contact that the Russians need to bypass for further offensive operation towards Siversk. So this defense belt also on the Russian fire, but for now without any changes. During the day, the Russians were bombing and attacking the Siversk and Siversk direction, trying to reduce the number of reinforcements and reserves that Ukrainians were deploying to Bilohorivka. On this video, we can see how the Russians managed to create another ambush on Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians were sending significant number of infantry using the light tracks. The Russians were controlling the main supply road, and at some point the Russians started bombing and attacking the area, and there were a lot of heavy explosions. Very likely the Ukrainians had losses and haven't managed to send reinforcements to the destination area. From the rear, deep rear, the Russians discovered another Ukrainian multiple launch rocket system Grad, and as a result of Lancet strike, that system was probably damaged or even destroyed. So the Russians tried to reduce the reserves, the Russians tried to destroy the Ukrainian reinforcements, the Russians tried to suppress Ukrainian artillery, the Russians tried to FPV drone Ukrainian, let's say, positions in the vicinity of landfill, but when times come to start the ground operation, the Russians can't do anything with this Bilohorivka and the hills around. So we'll see what is going to be next, but we see that the pressure from the Russian side is increasing and increasing every single day. Today, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation published a video of offensive operations towards Razdolovka. On this video, we can see the Russian Marines on board of the personnel carrier heading towards Razdolovka with the purpose to probably answer the village. This video was added softly. The only thing we have is that the armored group of Tula paratroopers destroyed a group of Ukrainian forces in a stronghold in the area of Razdolovka and Veselaya. So if you remember, just previous days we were talking that very soon the Russians will make first attempt to attack, and today the Minister of Defense published us the video of Russian attack. For now, we don't know whether the Russians managed to achieve some success to improve their positions. Let's wait, and obviously soon we're going to receive some updates. When talking about Ivanovsky direction, once again, another day, another fabbing, another artillery bombing, another clashes, but without any improvements on changes on the ground. The Russians still haven't managed to complete the battle for Ivanovsky, and as we discussed, the main reason of that is the hill located on to the northwest of the village. For now, the Russians don't have any solution how to suppress the Ukrainians there. The common methods they were using to do this before didn't help. Of course, the Russians deal significant damage to the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians have possibilities to send additional reserves from Chasiv Yar to the forest, so that's why they can keep some critical mass in the area and not allow the Russians to bypass this territory. So for now, I don't know what the Russians can do. Probably they're preparing another plan. They need to find a solution how to capture the hill, but they can't capture the hill without taking under control at least this tree line. They need somehow to bypass this area and then to move through the tree line to the south. This is the only possible solution, because this area is completely, let's say, there are field mines between these two positions and this open air, and very unlikely the Russians are able to cross. Just under the cover of the tree lines they can attack this hill, and then they can complete the battle for Ivanovska. About Ivanovska, we got additional geolocation of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions to the south of Ivanovska, so the clashes in this area continues. And we got another video of FPV drone strike in Klishchevka. On this video we can see the edge Russian positions on the northern part of the water reservoir, which confirms the Ukrainian control on the territory. So this video just we're using to clarify the Ukrainian position, and probably we need to adjust the map and at least to show this territory under complete Ukrainian control, because we have at least geolocation of that. And now we are moving further to Avdiivka area. We haven't received anything new in comparison with the previous video. As we discussed, the Russians established complete control over Orlovka. No, there was an important report. The Russians currently are trying to storm Semyonovka, and according to some pro-Russian resources, they managed to cross Durna river and to enter even the central street, Centralna street inside of Semyonovka. At least we got this report from some sources on the ground. Also, the Russians are storming the fortifications and the tree lines to the north of Orlovka with the purpose just to reduce the gray zone, reduce the line of combat contact, and to establish complete control over the fields that located between the village by the name of Berdichi and Orlovka. So the main purpose of the Russians for now in this direction is to reduce this area, to reduce the gray zone, to shorten, maintain the line of combat contact, and to release of additional forces that can be very useful somewhere else. For example, if we calculate this the line of combat contact according to this configuration of the front line, the distance from one position to another is around let's say 10 kilometers. But if the Russians are able to reduce this distance something like this, then the distance would be just 2 kilometers. So imagine yourself the number of forces that can be released, the number of special equipment that can be used somewhere else, and so this is now for the Russians the main purpose. Furthermore, this will allow the Russians to improve their logistic in Berdichi, because when talking about Berdichi, there are still problems to establish complete control over the village. Today the Russians published another video how they managed to enter and inspect the Abrams tanks, abandoned Abrams tanks, a tank in Berdichi itself. The Russians entered inside of the tank, make some movies, some film from inside. So I believe that they were very interesting, very excited to see the situation inside of Abrams. We see that as a result of FPV drone strike, maybe the tank was damaged from the outside, but from inside we see there are almost no damage from the Russian weapons. So pretty well armored vehicle, we can make a conclusion. Now we are moving to Tonenke. According to different mappers and different sources, the Ukrainians are leaving the area, and for now I expected that today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will include into their daily report the information about the full and complete control over the territory, but yet we haven't received this update. So our expectations are moving further to the next day. Very likely that this week the Russians will report something like this, but for now we see that there are still probably some issues, some problems, some let's say traps maybe from the Ukrainian side, some abandoned or rearguard forces or something like this. But anyway, we are waiting the date and the video of the final fall and the last minutes of this foothold, and after that the Russians will be able to move further. Interesting updates and interesting details are coming from area between Krasnogorovka and Novomykhailivka. And according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the southwest of Nivoyska and establish control over additional fields. For now, we don't have any reports and any geolocations confirming the progress, so we're adding this, let's say, area softly. The Russians continue bombing Krasnogorovka, trying to suppress the anti-tank positions that located on the southeast part of the stronghold. Another, let's say, attack from the long distance weapon, another destroyed position that will ease and probably a little bit make safer further Russian attempts to attack the southeastern part of the village. As you can see, we have a lot of geolocations from Georgievka. I'll remind you that just a few days ago, yesterday, we received a report that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the streets, this street, and furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainian 59th Brigade, some squad of 59th Brigade, completely surrendered in the area. So we see that the situation is very critical and getting worse and worse every day. Now we see just for one day significant number of geolocations of artillery strikes, FAB strikes, multiple launch rocket system strikes, different types of weapon, so which confirms that the Russians increased significantly pressure towards the city, towards the village, probably with the purpose to break the defense belt completely, to break the Ukrainian spirit, and they're willing to fight further and to clear the village and establish completely control over the territory. The main Russian goal is to get the southwestern part, southwestern outskirts of the village, which will allow the Russians to get to the operational space, and from this area they will be able to do whatever they like, including further attacks to Maximilianovka from the south, from the southeast, to attack the Ukrainian positions in this area. So this is a very important town that will allow the Russians, will give the Russians significant benefits, and from these positions the Russians in the very, let's say, not very near future, but in few months will be able to start movements further to the river Kashlygach and to, let's say, Konstantinovka, Novomykhailivka directions. Furthermore, the Russians were bombing the trenches and fortifications in the same area, few FPV drone strikes, so it reminds us some clearing operation with the purpose to attack very soon and to complete this story. And this is another aviation strike against the Ukrainian positions, another trenches were under very heavy fire. We expect additional ground operation. Now we are moving to Novomykhailivka, and today we got a lot of reports in comparison with the previous days. After a very short operational pause, the Russians renewed their offensive. First, the Russians were bombing the territory heavily with artillery and aviations, trying to suppress the Ukrainians in the trenches, and after the clearing operation, aviation clearing operation, the Russians launched the ground operation, and we got the first geolocation. The video was published, of course, by the forces of Ukrainian forces, so that's why we shouldn't expect like videos with very powerful breakthroughs from the Russian side. On this video we can see another Russian convoy with let's say 3 personnel carriers heading to the Ukrainian positions and trenches. Currently it's unknown and very difficult to understand whether the Russians managed to capture anything or not, but the video shows us the Russian progress, the Russian attack, and the Russian first attempts to attack these strongholds. So the attack probably the main goal was heading towards this area. This attack, first of all, confirms that the Russians control this area completely, and at least in the trenches there are the Russian soldiers. For currently this area is covered with the fog of war, but anyway we see that the Russians were planning to, let's say, to establish this control and to cut and to semi-encircle Novomykhailivka, to complete the semi-encirclement of Novomykhailivka from the north. Anyway, the next 2 days we're going to receive more details and updates and maybe some additional progress on the ground. Robotyne, we haven't received anything during the previous day, just the clashes, another video of abandoned leopard in the fields, and according to some mappers, exactly this part of the fields is under Ukraine control. So some mappers are showing the area like I do, but some mappers are showing that Robotyne is currently split in 2 parts. This part is under Russian control, and this part of Robotyne still remain under Ukraine control. So according to some mappers, this is approximately the current situation in the area. We haven't received anything from Kherson direction, just the regular activity. The only interesting report we got from the Ministry of Defense, and today the Ministry of Defense reported that they're planning, or they have already restored or created the Navy Dnipro group. So like they're planning to have some clashes along Dnipro River, and they're going to build a certain fleet for these purposes. Currently it's very difficult to understand what was the Ministry of Defense talking about, but anyway it sounds very interesting. And let's finalize the video with the political events. We have additional reports reports that the Ukraine is going to start receiving the first artillery shells, at least from the Czech Republic, just after June of 2024. So there are still up to 3 months to wait for the first supplies. We have statistics of Ukrainian corruption. Some sources managed to calculate how many Ukrainians, how much money the Ukrainians have already stolen, and to compare how many drones the military forces would be able to buy for this money. And they calculated roughly around 3 million drones could be bought for the money that Ukrainian authorities stole since the beginning of the special military operation. We have reports that the United States did not offer any specific assistance to Ukraine at the next meeting of the contact group on the military assistance to Kiev and the American military base Ramstein in Germany. And according to observers of the publications, the head of American Defense Department Austin gave only promises that democratic countries would not leave Ukraine in trouble. So we see that the United States of America slowly, step by step, is leaving Ukraine and giving this opportunity to the European countries to fight for Ukraine, but not from United States. An important report from the Ministry of Defense, according to them, as a result of clashes just this year, the Ukrainians lost 71,000 soldiers and 11,000 weapons. That was reported by the Ministry of Defense. These numbers completely, let's say, corresponds and fit to the numbers, to the calculations I do. According to my calculations, the Ukrainians lost by, let's say, 20th of March, 71,000 for 430 soldiers, but according to my calculations, the Ukrainians lost just 3,222 armored vehicles. But as I understand, according to Ministry of Defense, 11,000. So maybe there is some mistake, maybe from my side, maybe from their side. Anyway, we need more details to understand this situation. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.